I'll be piggybacking a little bit on John's presentation, but I'll be expanding a little bit to talk about how athletes, all athletes, can organize in a way that is within the existing structure that doesn't really lean on labor law rights as much as it does constitutional rights. And just to kind of give you some context about what it is that I do, I'm not a practicing attorney as far as I advocate, but I am, the focus of my scholarship as a doc student looks at student-athlete rights, altogether. So today, what I'll be using a little bit of history and law perspectives to kind of walk through what I propose as a way for athletes to organize, to kind of leverage their position to try to get equity in many So what I'll do is I'll talk through the problem. John did a really good job identifying the problem, so I'll kind of go through this. Talk about the consequences of the problem, the solution as I propose it, implications of my solution. I'll conclude and take questions, and I'm hoping that we can kind of a dialogue. This is actually a presentation I'm using for my qualifying exam, so any and all feedback would be amazing. Okay, so first, the problem. All right, so to simplify, the existing college board structure exploits college athletes. And so Marx is kind of the godfather of exploitation, right? And the way that he talked about exploitation was more in an economic context. And his definition of talking about exploitation is an unequal exchange in labor and goods. And those that are exploited put more in labor in the system than they get out of it. And those that exploit those people that are working as laborers, they get more out of it. And the way that Marx kind of described this is more in dollars and cents, right? And so media and people talk about exploitation a lot, and oftentimes they are talking about dollars and cents, right? But the way that we use exploitation today in a college context, particularly because the NCAA is all about non-commercialism, not talking about the money that we make back, we're like, well, how can college athletes be exploited? I argue that the exploitation isn't just economic, right? Economic exploitation is huge, but there's also this academic piece that John talked about a lot, right? And I was a college athlete myself, and so to stand up here and say I didn't get anything out of my experience would be a lie, right? I learned management, I'm getting a bunch of degrees, I've been in a position where I've had a lot of opportunities. But the fact that is that a lot of athletes are getting exploited because they're not reaching their full academic education. And I think that that's a problem, right? And so I think that this exploitation that we have to think about is, yes, there's economic exploitation, there's physical and economic control and not sharing profits with athletes, but athletes are also in this, what I call an athletic obsessed culture that makes them compromise their academic pursuits in favor of their athletic pursuits. And so when we think about this, what does not attaining full academic or educational potential look like? It means instead of joining sororities, instead of watching campus speakers, instead of joining student government or other student organizations, you're spending most of your time in athletics, which gives you a lot of benefits, but at the cost of other education benefits that you should be getting as a college student. And so when we think about this structure that exploits colleges, we think, okay, well, this exploitation is perpetuated, and we wonder why that is. And this is because there's no critical consciousness, that athletes aren't aware or conscious of their position, and also there's disunity, right? And so John talked in his presentation about athletes, black athletes, right, and their situation is they're revenue-generating sports. But we have a bunch of athletes in different contexts, different teams, different sports, different coaches, different budgets, where we're having all these different types of talk, right? All these athletes, it's hard for them to get on the same page and kind of have solidarity. And so when you have this unconsciousness and you have this disunity, the athletes aren't coming together to speak out because it's hard for them to have the same message. And when you have that, you are able, the exploiters are able to perpetuate this exploitation, and nobody speaks up on the athletes. And so what happens is athletes then become kind of complicit in this system, and in addition, the college athletes don't have a way to speak out. And this is what I call athlete voice suppression. So oftentimes people say athletes are silenced, but I think it goes one step further than that. I think their voice is actually suppressed. So versus someone just telling someone to be quiet and just don't speak, I think some athletes, as we see from the some athletes are stepping up, but their voices, someone is like blocking their voice or drowning them out. It's like athletes are standing up, screaming at the top of their lungs, but they're in a room, the door's shut, and then people are saying, okay, there's nothing to see here. And what I mean by that is with this voice suppression at every single level, institutional level, the national level, athletes aren't able to have a platform to speak out. So at the institutional level, we talked a little bit earlier about this conflict of interest. Athletes don't really have somewhere to go where they can talk about, my coach is really emotionally abusive, or I have an issue with my administrator, athletic director. We do have places where, like at where I am at University of Wisconsin, we have a very involved academic services office within the athletic department where you have advisors and people that you can go talk to and rely on. But if you think about it, those advisors are within the athletic department, and they have to report out to their coach, right? And so I interned a little bit in our academic services office, and everything that athletes would come and tell me, even athletes that were just on my mentor roster that would just come in because I played softball, so even though I wasn't overseeing softball, some softball athletes would come and talk to me because I identified with them. I still had to share out some of those things that were happening with athletes. And so when athletes have people that they can talk to, but they know that everything that they say to them isn't exactly in confidence, that's distrust. And so they're not going to be completely willing to share what's going on. And so when you have this situation at the institutional level where athletes don't have people that aren't free of that conflict of interest, they want to speak, but they feel like they can't speak, right? And then if you go one step further to the NCAA level, athletes do have SAC, right? You guys familiar with SAC? Student Athlete Advisory Committee, right? And I think at all big Division I institutions, they're mandated, right? So SAC is kind of like student government of athletes, and usually those athletes are chosen to sit on this board, represent their sport, and talk about NCAA regulations, what's going on with the institution. You have some athletes that are then picked to sit at the conference level and sometimes the NCAA level to talk about different student athlete issues, right? And so a lot of these athletes, they get involved, they bring up issues, some of them get resolved, like at Wisconsin, we needed more bike racks. And so SAC was a place where students got together and they're like, we need more bike racks, and went to administration, we got bike racks, right? So it is a space where athletes can go and talk, but when you're talking about athletes feeling like there's different issues and scholarships going on, people are clearing playing time, SAC doesn't become a space where you can have honest conversations about real life issues that are happening, right? So athletes can speak, but they can't speak freely. And I argue that suppresses their voice. And so when you think about these two issues at the institutional level and the NCAA level and conference level, as it goes all the way up, and athletes are being, their voice is being suppressed, they are limited in the ways that they can counter this exploitation. And that also happens in the legal realm when athletes aren't able to kind of litigate their issues either, right? So they can't go to their institution and create big level change. They can't go at the conference level or NCAA to create change through SAC. But then legally, a lot of lawsuits that athletes want to bring to the NCAA or their institutions are stopped at the front door with standing issues. So standing is like the concept where that gets you in the door. And so, and this is funny. So athletes, because they're not members of the NCAA itself, right? They go to NCAA membership institutions, but they're not NCAA members. They don't have standing to sue the NCAA. Okay, and this is the argument that NCAA has used for years to just sweep athlete lawsuits out. And so the fact that they can't bring NCAA lawsuits, they can't complain at their institution level, at their conference level, at the NCAA, their voice is silenced, and therefore, all of this is calculated. We cannot counter this expectation. Are you guys with me so far? Yeah. All right, so that's the problem. What consequences come because of this problem? So as I mentioned, athletes' voices are suppressed. They're denied the full college experience. And as we can kind of feel, right, this sense of this illegitimacy of the structure, it's palpable, right? That's why we're all here, because we know that there's something we need to do something about it. And it creates this sense of bitterness or inequality on the athletic side. But also, people within the system, they know something's wrong, but it's just kind of like, it's my career, you know, I'm an administrator, I'm doing what I need to do, keep my head down, I'm just, you know, doing my job. And as Natalie mentioned earlier, this is athletes in a really vulnerable position, right? And typically when we think of the vulnerable people in our society, they typically have advocates that can stand up for them, right? So think about people who are disabled people. A lot of disabled have advocates. In Wisconsin, we have an agency called Disability Rights Wisconsin that takes cases for disabled people in education, business, everything, so we can advocate for them. But we don't really have anything for athletes, right? We have the NCPA, which is kind of fractured. It's starting to do a lot of good work, a lot of good lobbying, but it's not a solid advocacy movement. And so this gap is what I want to address. So I propose a solution for athletes to come together, associate, and form a pseudo-team. So I'm not unsure if a lot of you are familiar with how the term student-athlete came about. Anyone know? No? Nobody? You want to elaborate? Right, yeah.
My understanding is a little bit there's some intentionality to it because they're a student athlete, they're a person student, and therefore don't have the same rights as like an employee.
Right.
Their participation is voluntary at that point,
Right.
and so protects the NCAA at that point.
Definitely, yeah. Both of you guys are right. You're not too far off. So, student athlete is the best marketing campaign that's ever happened in college sports, right? So definitely, now I'm going to simplify here just because I don't want to get bogged down in the legalese part. But basically, what happened was the NCAA was sued by an athlete, and actually had been sued several times by athletes that were either dying or severely injured, and the athletes wanted to recoup either disability benefits or death benefits. Their family wanted to get death benefits for the physical injuries that these people were sustaining on football fields. So you remember when the NCAA was first drafted, people were dying from football injuries, right? And so what happened was somebody sued and wanted workers' compensation benefits and won. And the NCAA just went crazy. They're like, we got to stop this, right? And so what happened was they're like, well, if we say student athletes and use these buzzwords that the time is voluntary, that we don't really control them, that this is a choice, that this is for recreation, this is not a job, we'll win. And that's what happened, right? And so, yes, college athletes are both students and they're athletes, and student comes first, and that's all fantastic. But also what's happening is that the NCAA is basically writing out the employee part, or any arguments that can be made that is an employee. Okay? So what we need to do to solve this problem, right, athletes can get these employee benefits, is we need to break the cycle. And how do we do that? I say we use student organizations. So fine, they're not employees and they're students. Let's use student rights. Let's stop using employment rights. If they're not employees, let's concede it. They're students. Let's use student rights. Okay. So the good thing with student rights is that constitutionally, constitutionally, we have the right to associate. And in a lot of public institutions, this right to associate is then insulated in registered student organization rights. Okay, and in a second, I'll show you exactly how these student rights laws are almost identical to the labor rights laws. And so if we just start using student rights laws, athletes can associate, get union-like benefits, and enjoy all the benefits that unions enjoy, but we'll just call them student organizations, and then we'll be able to work it. It's a good PR campaign, right? Okay. So I said earlier that I'm gonna be using a little bit of history, and this is kind of where I shift gears to talk about history, because athletes have done this before. And I'm gonna walk through a few examples of how athletes have used student rights to organize and get leverage for things that they wanted, and really stand up to athletic departments. And it took support, and it took being aware of their situation, and also unifying. And then so what I'll do is I'll kind of just talk about two in the interest of time. In the first, and you can, if you're interested in this, if you read the book, The Revolt of the Black Student Athlete by Dr. Harry Edwards, he goes through these revolts, and it's a fantastic book, and I strongly recommend it. But in his book, Dr. Edwards talks about 37 different revolts that happened between, I believe, 1967 and 1972 at different campuses. And if you remember, I don't know, a few of us are old enough to remember, but if you weren't alive then, like I wasn't, the time was very, very volatile. And you remember the Olympics, right? The Mexico City Olympics, when you have, the runners, the Black Power salute, right? Well, Tommy Smith, this picture here, was one of those that wore the black gloves, right? He went to San Jose State. So at San Jose State, you had a lot of athletes, and I know John had talked about when you had schools that were refusing to play schools that had black athletes. In the 1960s, you had black athletes that were there competing, but were refusing to go to schools that were being discriminatory. And at that time, you had black people competing on teams where if they went to a team hotel, the white students got to go somewhere else, but the hotel would not allow the black students, so then the black students had to go and lodge somewhere else for the night, right? Could you imagine your whole team about to play a game, you're driving up, they get off the bus, and you have to go somewhere else and sit and live in humane conditions, wake up the next day, and you're the star running back and be expected to play under those conditions. Can you imagine that? I couldn't. Right? So at San Jose State, student athletes were fed up. And what they did is they worked with their student government, and they worked with their on-campus black student unions, and a national organization, which I don't want to butcher, so I'm just gonna, I don't want to forget what it is. Okay, so the USBA, all right, we'll just go through this again. So the USBA was a national organization of black college-age students that were organizing all of these revolts. Okay, so they had a national movement, but also at each individual campus, the black students, and the student government were all working together to put on these revolts. So this picture up here is of San Jose State. Now this isn't an exact revolt of the nature that I'm talking about, but this is like a rally. Like they were having rallies all the time for wars, for just everything that was going on. San Jose State was ready to rally. But this gives you a picture of what the campus was like. And at San Jose State, they were able to do a lot of things because they were supporting one another. So, for instance, the students were really wanting racial equality. And so what they did is they went to administration and said, we are tired of the racial inequality. We want to make sure that students can have the same access to student organizations, to be able to date whoever they want, to be able to have the same lodging and safety needs. And if you don't do this, we are going to stop your ability to have your first home football game against Utah. And nothing happened. Administration didn't listen to the demand. And so what happened was the Utah game never happened. Okay? Now that at that time, that cost the campus about $100,000. Even today, money is about $600,000. But if you could imagine, or if you could think about the University of Wisconsin, which makes a couple million on the first home game, right? If that didn't happen, like everybody would go bananas, right? And at your campuses, could you imagine a football game just not happening? Well, like everybody would go crazy. And another example I'll just bring up quickly. UTEP, there were 8 black athletes who refused to run at BYU for a meet because the dates at BYU, their religion, Mormonism at the time wouldn't allow blacks into the priesthood, and so 8 black athletes were like, we're not running, and the coach said, okay, fine, hell with you, you're off the team. But the backlash was immense, and there was revolts like that where students were brave and said, we're not going to stand for this racism, and they were able to revolt. Now, fast forward to 2001, I have the NCPA up here, which began as the College Athlete Coalition. When Ramogi Humo was a football player at UCLA, he actually started that coalition as a registered student organization, and I had a conversation with him when I was researching for this paper, and he said he looked to his older brother, who was really involved in student government and wasn't an athlete, but said, I realized that in registered student organizations, you get access to campus, you're independent of SAC, you're independent of the athletic department, and you're able to kind of work with students to support you in your mission. And so when you think about Ramogi and how he formed the NCPA, it all started as a registered student organization on campus. And so when you think about what registered student organization, the rights that it affords, I've placed on your left the labor law rights that you can get by being considered an employee, and as a student, the laws that the benefits that you can receive in a registered student organization, and they're identical. As an employee, you get the right to unionize. As a student, you get the right to organize, and you can all read, so you can see them here. But they're identical. You could be recognized by administration. You can protest, and granted, these rights work in public institutions. Private institutions will have to figure something out, but I'm sure that there's a way that we can work it out. But the biggest thing here is peaceably protest, and that is a right. And one way that this right can take form is by withholding segregated fees. Now, someone just I was at Ash in the fall, and someone is putting together some research showing how much of student fees go into athletic departments, and I was surprised when Wisconsin was up there. Now, Wisconsin is one of the few athletic departments that is in the black every year, but there's some sort of creative accounting where some athletic fees are still shoveled into the athletic department. So I'm not quite sure how this works, so I'm looking forward to this publication so I can find more evidence for how this works. And so we talk about like why do this, why organize. There's an economic benefit, right? If athletes unionize, we can talk about how we're going to get paid or things like that. But there's a lot of other benefits that all athletes can have, right? So there's a lot of childcare issues that athletes can work through. A lot of my friends that were in college and played football when I was playing softball had children, right? And sometimes they brought their parents up or someone to have the child visit them, but their child wasn't living with them. Imagine a place where a child could live with their parent or parents, and the parent can still go to school and still enjoy being an athlete. Imagine that space. That space doesn't really exist now. And there's a lot of health benefits that athletes can derive too. So we all saw the basketball game where the athlete went up and broke his leg. Were you guys watching? Yeah. So, and those issues, right, that kind of shocked the world into paying attention to the type of health care that athletes can get before, during, and after their career. So there's lots of things outside of just getting paid in compensation that we can talk about in a registered student organization. And then also just being in a student organization affords a lot of benefits that we want our athletes to get anyway, right? Leadership skills, accountability, self-advocacy, all great things. So some of the implications and barriers that we need to think about, that future study needs to think about, is logistical concerns. How does this happen? Do we have a national organization and then satellite chapters on campus, or does each campus and their different contexts require different organizations? That needs to be thought through. We need to think about how these registered student organizations are going to exist with SAC, or within SAC, or outside of SAC, or not talk to them. We need to talk about that. We need athletes to become more aware of their vulnerabilities. We need to get over anti-union sentiment, which is running ragged. I know it's really, really thick in Wisconsin right now. And then also think about what this organization is and what's its mission. And so I'll just conclude with this. Regardless of the exact path taken, student athletes must step up, utilize their natural leverage, and force parties to take notice. They can no longer afford to be manipulated, ignored, or discounted. And this quote is taken from Michael Aguda, who was one of the on the board of, I think it was the national president when Ramogi Huma was really involved with forming the NCPA. And the fact that Michael was so against the NCPA, but has written articles that show that he actually was, after it was all said and done, he was like, you know what, we need to do something. I think this is pressing, and we need to do something. So with that, I'll take any questions, and thank you for listening. Yeah, and you said a lot there, and so there's a couple things that come up, right? I think you're right. There was a time when athletes were great, right? And were supported and in the context, you think about some of the issues that athletes used to stand up for, and it was like a race issue, right? It was an overt social issue where a lot of people, even if they weren't in the athletic context, could stand up and say, you know what, we support you, right? And now it's a little bit different. But I disagree with you. I diverge in thinking that we need to go back. I think we need a new type of group, right? In the way of technology now, athletes can send a tweet and be revolutionizing, and 100 people would care, right? That wasn't the case back then. Thanks. Yes, spoken word, right?
Could you say that one more time? I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Could you say that one more time?
I was saying that we need a new type of bravery. So with technology, athletes can be revolutionizing, and 100 people would care, right? But I think that what needs to happen first is athletes need to recognize their own sense of power, right? This critical consciousness. And so I sit on the athletic board at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And what a lot of students don't know, a lot of student athletes don't know, is there are 4 student positions on this athletic board. Okay, 2 appointed from student government, and 2 that are kind of assumed through SAC, one's a SAC rep, and another one is a SACO rep, which is a registered student organization of student athletes that want to kind of empower and work with diversity issues, right? I can't tell you how many times those students haven't come to meetings, okay? I'm no longer a student athlete, but when things come up that involve student athletes, I raise my hand and I talk, but I'm no longer a student athlete. I'm not sitting across from my coaches and my administrators. I can say whatever the hell I want, right? Those athletes, when they're not there, we notice, and they can't say anything, but also when they are there, I don't know if they, I can't tell you, I'm not in their brains, I don't know why they're not speaking, but sometimes I can tell, especially when I'm see her brain moving, and I can see when things are going on and she wants to say something, but she lets the moment pass. So I think when people are in the position that they can't speak, they need to.
Right. And not go back to the time, go back to those people how they feel different. Because I speak up now because of how I feel back then.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't mean that